Late November 1493, 17 Spanish ships slow off a Caribbean coast the crews already know. Past the tree line sits a fort built from the broken planks of Columbus's own flagship, and 39 men left behind almost a year earlier to guard it. The fleet expects smoke, voices, gold waiting on the sand. What it finds instead is ash. No fort standing, no men, not one. Tell us in the comments what time it is where you are right now, and where in the world you're watching from. It's strange to think how far one burned beach can reach. Thank you, and we are starting. Christopher Columbus is standing on the deck of his ship, and he is not worried yet. He has good reason not to be. A year earlier, on Christmas Day 1492, his flagship, the Santa Maria, had run aground on a reef off this same coast. Rather than lose the ship entirely, Columbus ordered his men to strip it for timber and build something solid on land. What went up was small, a stockade, a few storerooms, a lookout post, but it was real, and it was the first structure Europeans had ever built in the Americas. He named it Villa de la Navidad, the town of the Nativity, after the day the ship had wrecked. 39 men stayed behind. Some were sailors. Some, by more than one account, were men whose criminal charges back in Spain had been quietly suspended in exchange for making the voyage. Columbus left them with instructions to explore the coastline, keep peace with the local Tano villages, and gather gold until he returned with a larger expedition. That is the version of the story most people already carry with them, even if they've never thought about it directly. Columbus crossed an ocean, found land, made contact, and the whole affair proceeded from there in a more or less orderly fashion, ships back and forth, trade beginning, a new world opening up. It's the version that fits neatly into a single sentence for a textbook page. It is also, on this particular beach, about to fall apart. You can picture the scene the way the men on those 17 ships would have experienced it. The approach by water, the coastline sliding past, familiar landmarks from the year before, and then the moment someone on deck realizes the smoke they expected to see rising from cook fires simply isn't there. No dogs barking. No canoes coming out to meet them, the way they had the year before, when the Tano of this coast had waded into the surf with parrots and spun cotton as gifts. Just quiet, and a shoreline that looked wrong in a way nobody could immediately name. When the landing party finally reached the fort, they found what was left of it. Blackened posts, a collapsed roofline, ash where a stockade wall had stood, salvaged nails and scraps of iron lay scattered where storerooms had burned down to their foundations. There were no bodies laid out for burial, no wounded survivors waiting to be found, just wreckage, and a silence that felt deliberate rather than accidental. Nearby, the physician travelling with the fleet, Diego Luverez Chanca, recorded what they saw and what they were told. The Tano living close to the ruins were evasive. Their answers didn't line up. Whatever had happened here, no one wanted to say it plainly, and the Spanish had no way to force a clear account out of people who, understandably, weren't eager to explain it to armed strangers standing over the wreckage of their own countrymen. You can imagine the search that followed, small parties fanning out from the ruins, checking the tree line, calling names into brush that had already begun reclaiming a settlement barely a year old. Columbus questioned Guacanaga, the cacique who had welcomed him so warmly the year before, offering parrots and spun cotton as tokens of friendship. This time Guacanaga appeared wounded, though whether the injury was real or convenient is something chroniclers still cannot settle, and his explanation shifted depending on who was asking and what they seemed to want to hear. Some of Columbus's own men suspected he knew more than he admitted. Others believed he too had been overrun by rivals he couldn't control. 5 centuries later, historians still cannot fully resolve which version, if either, is complete. Here is the problem with the peaceful discovery version of this story. It cannot survive first contact with what was actually found on this beach. 39 men, left to keep watch over a friendly outpost, were gone. Not scattered, not captured. Dead, all of them, as far as anyone could determine, and their fort burned down around them within a single year. At first, the explanation offered was simple enough on the Spanish side: hostile natives, unprovoked violence, a lesson in caution for the next settlement. That is the story that fit what Columbus and his men wanted to believe about themselves. But even in 1493, some of the men present were uneasy with how clean that explanation sounded. Later accounts, pieced together from Spanish sources, since no Tanno testimony from this specific event survives, point toward a messier truth. They describe internal discipline collapsing inside the fort almost as soon as Columbus's ships had sailed over the horizon. Men splitting off from the group, Tanno women being taken, sometimes by force, in ways that violated agreements Columbus himself claimed to have made with the local cacique, a leader named Guacanagar, who had welcomed the Spanish warmly the year before and seemed to want an alliance with them. Somewhere between that goodwill and the ashes Columbus's fleet now stood in front of, something had gone badly wrong, and multiple threads of blame: Spanish misconduct, internal fighting among the 39, and a rival Tanno leader named Caonabo, who ruled a neighbouring territory and had little patience for the newcomers, seemed to converge. That is the honest, uncomfortable shape of what the evidence suggests, and it is worth sitting with, because it does not flatter anyone. This was not a clash between innocence and savagery on one side or the other. It was a small, isolated group of armed men, cut off from resupply, operating without oversight, in contact with a population that had welcomed them and then had reason not to. Whatever exactly triggered the final attack, the outcome was total: a fort in ashes, and not one survivor left to tell his own version of events. The most cautious modern historians are careful here not to hand the story a tidy villain. There is no surviving Tanno account of what happened at La Navidad. Every version we have comes from Spanish sources, written by men who were not present for the attack, and who had every reason to frame it in whatever light made their own countrymen look least responsible. That absence matters. It means the why of La Navidad is not a solved case with a clean answer waiting at the end of an investigation. It is a gap in the record that has stayed open for over 500 years, and it is likely to stay that way. What can be said with more confidence is the shape of the pattern, because it would repeat Spanish demands outpacing what a small, unsupervised outpost could sustain. A local population initially willing to cooperate, and a breakdown that turned lethal faster than anyone expected. You have to sit with what that means for the larger story being told here. This wasn't a footnote. La Navidad was the very first European settlement in the Americas, the literal starting point of everything that followed. The place where the New World as Europeans understood it technically began. And it lasted less than a year before it was wiped off the map so completely that men returning with 17 ships and well over 1,000 soldiers could not find a single survivor to question. Columbus did not linger at the ruins, whatever he felt standing in front of that ash. And later writers have imagined everything from fury to grief to cold calculation. His response was to move on and start again, this time further east along the coast, at a site he called La Isabela. It would become the first planned town built by Europeans in the Americas, laid out on paper with a church, a governor's house, storehouses for the goods his fleet carried. On paper, it looked like the beginning of order. In practice, as the next chapter will show, La Isabela would struggle with problems that had nothing to do with hostile natives at all. Problems the Spanish had, in a sense, brought with them in their own bodies, without knowing it. But before this story moves forward, it is worth staying a moment longer on what La Navidad actually represents, because the destruction of that first outpost set a pattern that would repeat itself in different forms again and again over the century that followed. A promise of peaceful coexistence, undercut almost immediately by exploitation, a local population willing to negotiate, met instead with force. A version of events written down only by the side that survived to write it. Historians today still cannot say with full certainty what happened at La Navidad in those missing months. The documentary record is thin, second-hand, and shaped entirely by Spanish witnesses arriving after the fact. What can be said is this: the discovery of the Americas did not begin with a handshake that held. It began with a fort that burned down within a year, and a silence on that beach that nobody who survived could fully explain. That silence should have been a warning. Instead, it became the opening chapter of something far larger. 100 years of expansion, extraction, disease, and resistance that would eventually reach empires Columbus never lived to see, thousands of miles from this exact stretch of sand. Somewhere in the century that followed, a Dominican friar would call the entire system built on nights like this one a mortal sin, in front of a church full of men who profited from it. A cacica named Anacaona would try friendship instead of resistance, and it would not save her. A chief named Hatue would run rather than fight, warn an entire island of what was coming, and still end up tied to a stake. And a disease no one in either fleet could see would eventually do more damage than every sword, cannon, and act of betrayal combined, reaching a capital city Columbus had never even heard of. None of that was visible yet, standing on this ash-covered beach in November of 1493. What was visible was simpler, and in its own way more unsettling. A plan that had looked reasonable on paper: leave some men, build a fort, keep the peace, gather gold, return for them, had failed completely within a single year, in ways nobody on either side had fully anticipated or could fully explain. If you had been standing on the deck of one of those 17 ships, watching the coastline for smoke that never came, you would not yet have known you were witnessing the first entry in a ledger that would eventually stretch across an entire hemisphere. You would only have known that something had gone wrong, quietly, while no one from Spain was watching, and that whatever Columbus had believed he was building here, it had not survived contact with what the New World actually was. To understand how a burned outpost of 39 men could set 100 years of chaos in motion, you first need to understand what Columbus and Spain believed they were building here in the first place, the version of the plan that still looked, on paper, like it might work. To understand what actually failed at La Navidad, you have to understand what Columbus believed he was doing there in the first place, because on paper, in the language of the Spanish court, none of this was supposed to look like conquest. It was supposed to look like a partnership. Early in 1494, a few months after finding the ashes of his first outpost, Columbus founded a second settlement further east along the same coast. He called it La Isabela, after the queen who had financed his voyage, and this time the plans were far more ambitious than a stockade thrown together from wreckage. Surveyors laid out streets. Masons began work on a stone church. A governor's house went up near the centre of town, along with storehouses meant to hold the goods and provisions carried across the Atlantic by a fleet of 17 ships. On a map drawn back in Spain, La Isabela would have looked like the beginning of a proper colony, organised, permanent, self-sustaining. The reality on the ground told a different story almost immediately. The site itself was poorly chosen, swampy in places, short on reliable fresh water, exposed to disease that Spanish planners hadn't accounted for and couldn't yet explain. Within months, colonists were falling sick in numbers that alarmed even Columbus, who had staked his reputation and increasingly his family's fortunes on this venture succeeding. Food supplies ran low faster than expected, since the fleet had provisioned for a voyage, not for sustaining more than 1,000 people indefinitely on unfamiliar soil. Skilled tradesmen who had signed on expecting quick riches, men listed in the ship manifests as carpenters, tailors, a physician, even a small number of minor nobility hoping to make their fortune, found themselves doing manual labour in a climate that punished them for it. Discipline began to fray in ways that echoed, uncomfortably, what had apparently happened at La Navidad. Columbus's own brothers, Diego and Bartholomew, were drawn into the day-to-day administration of a settlement that increasingly resembled a struggling outpost rather than the proper colony the paperwork back in Spain had promised. You can picture the physical texture of that failure without much effort: half-finished stone walls left exposed to rain, storehouses meant for gold, and provisions instead holding sick men on cots, a governor's house standing mostly empty of the order it was supposed to represent. This was not the orderly new world the paperwork had promised. And underneath all of it sat one demand that Columbus had already put in motion on his way back to Hispaniola: gold. Here is where the story of peaceful exploration runs into its second contradiction, and this one is even harder to explain away than the first. On his second voyage, the same voyage that discovered La Navidad in ruins, Columbus implemented a tribute system aimed squarely at the Tano population of the island. Every Tano man over the age of 14 was required to deliver a set quantity of gold on a recurring basis. Anyone unable to meet the quota could substitute a fixed amount of raw cotton instead, 25 pounds per person, according to the accounts that survive. Fail to meet either requirement, and the consequences range from punishment to mutilation, depending on which chronicler you read and how far into the system's later years the account was written. Sit with that for a moment. This is not a later, more brutal phase of colonization that developed slowly, decade by decade, as relations soured. This is a demand imposed within roughly a year of first contact on a population that, by the Spanish's own initial accounts, had greeted Columbus's men with gifts, curiosity, and what one chronicler called friendship so complete it seemed like a marvel. The version of this story that gets told in a single triumphant sentence: Columbus crossed the ocean, found land, opened trade, leaves out the part where trade meant a fixed enforced quota backed by the threat of violence, arriving before the first anniversary of contact had even passed. It is worth being precise about what the tribute demand actually looked like in practice, because the vagueness of gold quota can make it sound more abstract than it was. Communities were assigned specific amounts tied to individual men rather than villages as a whole, and the assignment did not account for whether a given territory even had accessible gold deposits nearby. Some caciques attempted to negotiate reduced amounts. Others tried to comply as fully as possible, hoping compliance would buy their people some measure of safety. Neither strategy proved reliable, because the system itself had been designed around Spanish expectations of wealth rather than any realistic survey of what the island could produce. The cotton substitute, £25 per adult, according to surviving accounts, sounds almost administrative when written down as a single figure, but it represented weeks of spinning and weaving labour layered on top of whatever subsistence farming and fishing a household already depended on to survive. It was not an alternative to hardship, it was simply a different shape of the same demand. The math of the quota system alone should have been a warning sign to anyone paying attention. Gold on Hispaniola was not evenly distributed or easy to extract in the quantities the Spanish were demanding. Panning riverbeds and picking through stream beds for gold dust is slow, physically exhausting work, and the island's actual gold deposits were nowhere near rich enough to sustain the volume the tribute system assumed, which meant that from the very beginning, the system was built on an impossible premise: extract enough gold to satisfy the Spanish crown's expectations, from a landscape that could not reliably produce it, using labour drawn from a population whose numbers, as later chapters will show, nobody had actually counted with any precision. That last point matters more than it might seem at first. The old assumption buried inside the discovery story is that European exploration in this era was fundamentally about curiosity and commerce. Ships venturing into the unknown to establish trade relationships between two willing parties. It's the framing that fits comfortably into a hero's narrative: intrepid explorer, uncharted lands, mutual benefit. But a trade relationship built on voluntary exchange doesn't need an enforced quota with a punishment clause attached. What Columbus set in motion in 1494 wasn't trade in any meaningful sense. It was extraction, formalised within months of first contact, backed by force, and aimed at a population that had no real say in the terms. You can picture what this looked like on the ground, because the pattern would repeat itself across the Caribbean for the following century. Tano men wading into rivers with woven baskets, sifting sediment for grains of gold too small to see clearly, while overseers kept count against a quota set an ocean away by men who had never seen the riverbed in question. Villages that couldn't meet their assigned amount faced consequences that grew harsher as the system matured, first warnings, then physical punishment, and eventually, as chroniclers like Bartolomé de las Casas would later document in horrifying detail, mutilation for repeat failure. Las Casas, writing decades later as an eyewitness to the system's later, more entrenched form. Described men sent out with tokens marking whether they had delivered their quota, and the brutal consequences awaiting those who returned without one. It is important to be careful here, Las Casas wrote as an advocate against the very system he was describing, and historians read his testimony as a passionate, engaged eyewitness account rather than a neutral statistical record. But even accounting for that, the underlying structure he describes matches what independent Spanish administrative sources confirm about how the tribute demands were enforced. None of this required a formal legal structure yet. The encomienda system, which would eventually organise all of this under an official framework, was still 8 years away. What existed in 1494 was something rawer and, in some ways, more revealing, the underlying logic of extraction, operating in the open, before anyone had bothered to give it institutional cover. Meanwhile, La Isabela itself was quietly falling apart. Roughly a third of the settlers, by some estimates, had died within the first year, not from tanno resistance, but from disease, malnutrition, and the physical toll of forced labour in an unfamiliar climate. This detail deserves attention because it complicates the story in a way that's easy to miss. The same colonial system that was extracting gold and cotton from the tanno population was also, simultaneously, killing off a significant portion of the Spanish settlers sent to run it. Nobody involved in 1494 fully understood why. The explanations available to them, bad air, unlucky placement, divine punishment, poor planning, all missed the piece of the picture that would only become clear later. Something biological, something neither side could see, was already moving through both populations, and it had arrived on the very ships that carried the gold quotas. There is a strange symmetry worth sitting with here. The Spanish had crossed an ocean believing they were bringing order, faith and civilization to a new world they assumed was empty of anything worth the name. Instead, within 2 years, their own flagship settlement was half empty of the living. Its survivors weakened, its supply lines strained. Its administrators writing increasingly desperate letters back to the crown, asking for reinforcements, food and medicine. Whatever La Isabela was supposed to prove about Spanish superiority and Spanish planning, its actual condition on the ground told a much less flattering story, one of improvisation, sickness, and a labour system already straining under demands it could not sustainably meet. Even the colonists who survived that first year were, by most surviving accounts, thinner, sicker, and far less confident in the venture than the men who had sailed so triumphantly out of Cadiz. That thread, the invisible one, the sickness nobody could name yet, is where this story is about to go next. But first it's worth returning to the central image of this chapter, a stone church half-built in a swampy, poorly chosen town, storehouses meant to hold riches that the island could not actually produce in the quantities demanded, and a tribute system already grinding forward against a population whose true size nobody had bothered to measure. Columbus had promised the Spanish crown a new world of orderly wealth. What he had actually built, within 2 years of discovery, was an extraction machine running on debt it could never repay. A debt measured in gold dust, cotton, and, increasingly, in the exhaustion of the people forced to pay it. The old story says exploration led to trade. The physical record on the ground at La Isabela says something colder. Exploration led almost immediately to an enforced quota system that the land itself could not sustain, aimed at a population whose actual numbers were about to become one of the most contested and unsettling mysteries of this entire history. Because before anyone can explain how so many people came to disappear from this island within a single generation, someone first has to answer a much stranger question. How many people were even here to begin with? And why can no one, not Columbus's own men, not the Spanish crown, not modern historians armed with archives and archaeology, agree on an answer even now? In 1507, Spanish officials on Hispaniola attempted something that sounds almost mundane. A count, not a full census in the modern sense, but an effort to get a workable figure for how many Tano people remained on the island under Spanish administration. likely motivated by the practical need to know how much labour and tribute the colony could still extract. The number they arrived at was roughly 60,000. That number, on its own, means very little. To understand why it matters, you have to place it next to the other numbers historians have proposed for the same population at the moment Columbus first arrived, 15 years earlier, and here the story runs into a problem that has nothing to do with disease, violence, or resistance. It runs into a problem of simple accounting, and it turns out to be one of the strangest and most unsettling parts of this entire history. Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar who would later become the loudest Spanish voice against the colonial system, wrote at different points that the Tano population of Hispaniola before Spanish arrival numbered somewhere between 3 and 8 million people. Modern historians working with archaeological surveys, settlement density studies, and comparative demographic modelling have proposed figures that vary wildly depending on method, some as low as 100,000, others in the range of 3 to 400,000, a small number of researchers willing to entertain numbers in the low millions under specific assumptions about settlement. Density across the island's 5 chiefdoms. Here is the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. Nobody counted. Not in 1492, not in 1493, not for years afterward. There was no census, no systematic survey, no reliable method for establishing a baseline before the population began to collapse. Every number attached to how many Tano lived on Hispaniola when Columbus arrived is a reconstruction built backward from incomplete records. Chronicler estimates written by men with their own reasons to exaggerate or minimise, and modern models that rely on assumptions about population density that themselves remain contested. This matters because it changes the shape of the question people usually ask about this period. The common framing is, how many people died? That framing assumes we know how many people there were to begin with, and that the only uncertain variable is the scale of the loss. But if the starting number itself spans more than an order of magnitude, from 100,000 at the low end to several million at the high end, then the honest answer to how many died isn't a number at all. It's a range so wide that it can encompass catastrophic loss under any interpretation, while still leaving genuine, serious uncertainty about the precise scale. You can feel the strangeness of this if you try to picture it physically. Imagine standing on a hillside overlooking one of Hispaniola's river valleys in 1492, trying to estimate how many people live within sight, based only on smoke from cook fires, cleared farmland, and scattered settlements visible from a distance. You would see farming terraces, canoe landings along the riverbank, perhaps a ceremonial bull court marking a village centre, real physical evidence of an organised populated landscape, but nothing that translates cleanly into a number. Now imagine that same exercise repeated across an island roughly the size of South Carolina, divided into 5 separate chiefdoms: Marin, Magoo, Maguana, Jaragua, and Haiji, each with its own population density, its own agricultural capacity, its own settlement pattern, and no unified authority keeping records the way European kingdoms did. Nobody in 1492 did this exercise systematically. The Spanish were focused on gold, not head counts. By the time anyone had a strong institutional reason to count carefully, the population had already begun to shrink, which means even the earliest reliable figures we have are themselves measuring a population already in decline, not the population that existed at first contact. What can be said with more confidence, because it rests on actual administrative records rather than reconstruction, is the trajectory after 1507. That count of roughly 60,000 did not hold. By 1531, the same population, counted by the same kind of Spanish administrative apparatus, with real incentive to track a labour force it depended on, had fallen to approximately 600. By 1548, some estimates put the number below 500. These are not chronicler impressions or contested demographic models. These are figures drawn from Spanish records tracking a population they had every practical reason to monitor closely, because that population was the labour force the entire colonial economy depended on. That trajectory, 60,000 to roughly 600 in 24 years, is not a gradual decline. It is closer to a near-total collapse, and it happened within a single generation, to people who were, by the account of the very administrators counting them, still alive and present in significant numbers as recently as 1507. At first, the easiest explanation available to the Spanish and to later historians was war and open resistance. There had been fighting. The capture of the cacique Caonabo in 1494 marked the first major armed uprising against Spanish rule on the island. Caonabo ruled the chiefdom of Maguana, and Spanish accounts describe him as the leader most associated with organising resistance against the newcomers, including, by some accounts, the attack that destroyed La Navidad the previous year. His capture came not through open battle, but through deception. Spanish forces lured him into custody rather than defeating him in the field, a detail that itself tells you something about the limits of direct military confrontation on both sides. He died in Spanish captivity without ever standing trial or offering his own account of events. Skirmishes continued in various chiefdoms for years afterward, flaring and subsiding as different caciques tested different strategies against an occupying force that showed no sign of leaving. War alone, however, cannot explain numbers of this scale. Armed conflict, even sustained and brutal conflict, does not typically reduce a population from tens of thousands to a few hundred within a generation, unless something else is compounding it. You can picture the difference in scale directly. A punitive raid against a resisting village might kill dozens, even hundreds, in a single brutal episode. It does not, on its own, erase 60,000 people down to 600 within 24 years. Something else had to be doing the heavier work of that collapse, working quietly in the background while war and tribute demands captured most of the written attention. This is where the story has to be told carefully, because it would be easy to reach for a single dramatic cause and stop there. The physical and documentary record instead points towards several forces operating simultaneously and reinforcing one another. The tribute and labour demands already described, which pulled able-bodied people away from farming and fishing and toward mining and cotton production, weakening the broader food security of entire communities and making them more vulnerable to illness and famine alike. Direct violence, including punitive expeditions against villages that resisted or failed to meet quotas, forced relocation of labour between regions, which disrupted the kinship and agricultural networks that had sustained Tano communities for generations, and disease, which by this point had already begun moving through the population in ways nobody could yet track or name with precision, building on the 1493 outbreak at La Isabela described in the previous chapter. Historians continue to debate the relative weight of each factor, and the debate is not settled. What is settled is that all three, labour, violence and disease, were present at the same time, acting on the same population, and that no single explanation accounts for the full scale of what the 1531 and 1548 figures show. There is also a harder question sitting underneath the population debate, one that historians approach with real caution: whether the term that best describes this collapse is genocide, in the modern legal and historical sense of the word, or something closer to a catastrophic demographic disaster driven substantially by disease that colonial administrators neither fully understood nor, in some documented cases, actively sought to prevent. The case for the harsher term rests on documented, deliberate policy, forced labour quotas that showed no adjustment for a shrinking population, punitive violence against resisting communities, and, as later chapters will show, direct massacres of Tano leadership carried out under the pretense of diplomacy. The case for the more cautious framing rests on the timeline of disease itself, which moved through populations with no prior exposure to Old World pathogens, regardless of any single colonial policy, and which epidemiologists argue would have caused catastrophic mortality even under a hypothetically less brutal administration. Reasonable historians land in different places on this question, and the disagreement isn't a dodge. It reflects real uncertainty about intent, mechanism, and the relative weight of policy versus pathogen in a collapse this large. What isn't contested is the outcome itself, visible in the Spanish crown's own records. A population that numbered in at least the tens of thousands in 1507 had, within a single generation, been reduced to a number small enough to count on a few pages. You have to sit with the scale of that, because it's easy to let large numbers become abstract. 60,000 people is not a statistic. It is every household in dozens of villages across 5 chiefdoms, every fisherman, every farmer, every child born into a world that had existed on this island for centuries before Columbus's ships appeared on the horizon. 624 years later is what remained of all of that, according to the Spanish administrators, who had every reason to count carefully because their own colonial economy depended on the labour those people represented. And even that number, 600, undersells the trajectory Hispaniola's original inhabitants were on, because the mechanisms driving that collapse were not slowing down by the 1530s. They were, if anything, only just beginning to reach their most devastating phase. One of those mechanisms had already made its first appearance back in 1493 at La Isabela, in a form so mild by comparison to what was coming that almost nobody at the time thought to connect the two events. That first outbreak looked, to the people who lived through it, like ordinary sickness, the kind any crowded, poorly supplied settlement might expect. It would take another 25 years for the true scale of what had arrived on those ships to reveal itself. And, when it did, it would not stop at the shores of this one island. It would travel by canoe, by trade route, and eventually by Spanish ship, into territories whose rulers had never heard of Columbus, La Navidad, or any of the events described so far. Proof that the chain of consequences set in motion on that first burned beach was only beginning to reach its full hemispheric scale. Sometime in 1493, within months of La Isabela's founding, people in that settlement began falling ill in a way nobody had a name for yet. Fever came first, then weakness so severe that men who had crossed an entire ocean without complaint could no longer stand at their posts. It moved through the Spanish colonists. It moved through the Tano living nearby. It did not seem to care which side of the new frontier a person stood on, and that detail alone should tell you something important about what was actually happening here, underneath all the politics of tribute and conquest. Picture the physical texture of it. Crowded shelters built for a healthy workforce, now holding men too weak to leave their cots. Water carried by whoever could still walk. The smell of a sick room mixing with the salt air and unfinished stonework of a colony still being built around its own patients. There was no isolation protocol, no understanding of contagion in the modern sense, just the slow, frightening realization that whatever this illness was, it was spreading faster than anyone could contain it, and it was reaching people who had nothing to do with each other by trade, alliance, or proximity, beyond simply sharing the same stretch of coastline. Modern epidemiological review of the documentary record points to influenza as the most likely culprit. An ordinary, familiar illness by European standards, the kind that swept through crowded ships and crowded towns routinely and rarely made it into the history books as anything more than background noise. That ordinariness is exactly what makes this outbreak worth pausing on. This was not smallpox. Smallpox would not be recorded on Hispaniola for another 25 years. What struck La Isabela in 1493 was something far more mundane, and that is precisely the point. The biological invasion of the Americas did not begin with the most dramatic, most devastating disease available. It began with something as ordinary as the flu, arriving quietly on the same ships that carried gold quotas and building plans, doing damage nobody at the time thought to connect to the larger pattern of what was happening on this island. The old assumption buried in most popular tellings of this history is that disease devastated the Americas as a single, later dramatic event, usually associated with smallpox, and usually associated with the conquest of Mexico decades after Columbus. That version compresses a much longer, messier timeline into one clean turning point. The actual record shows something different. The biological exchange between the Old World and the New began almost immediately in the very first permanent Spanish settlement, years before anyone involved understood what was happening or why it mattered. Here is the contradiction worth sitting with. The Spanish arrived believing themselves to be the stronger, more advanced civilization, bringing steel, gunpowder, and organization to a population they viewed as primitive by comparison. And yet, in that first year at La Isabela, it was the Spanish who were dying in significant numbers. By some estimates, roughly a third of the settlement's population within 12 months, from an illness that had nothing to do with Tano resistance, Tano weapons, or Tano strategy. Whatever superiority the Spanish believed they carried with them, their own bodies were just as vulnerable to fever and contagion as anyone else's. The difference, which would become horrifyingly clear over the following decades, is that the Tano had no prior exposure to these old-world pathogens at all, while the Spanish, coming from crowded European cities that had circulated diseases like influenza for centuries, carried at least partial immunity built up over generations. That asymmetry, not superiority, not inferiority, but simple prior exposure, is one of the more uncomfortable pieces of this story, because it strips away the narrative both sides might have preferred to tell about what was happening. The Spanish were not winning through strength alone, and the Tano were not losing through weakness alone. A population with no immunological history against a pathogen will suffer catastrophically regardless of how organised, resilient, or well adapted that population is to every other challenge its environment presents. This is not a story about one people being naturally hardier than another. It is a story about which populations had, by historical accident, spent centuries building resistance to a specific set of diseases through repeated exposure in crowded cities and shared livestock, and which had lived for thousands of years on islands and continents where those same pathogens simply did not exist to build resistance against in the first place. It's worth pausing here on what that isolation actually meant in practical terms. The Tano, like other indigenous peoples of the Americas, had developed sophisticated agriculture, navigation, pottery, and social organization across many centuries. None of that is in question. What they had not developed, because they had no opportunity to, was population-level immunity to diseases like influenza, measles, and smallpox, all of which had circulated through old-world populations living in dense proximity to domesticated livestock for thousands of years. That specific narrow gap, not intelligence, not organisation, not resilience, but immunological history, would prove to be one of the single most consequential differences in this entire story, more consequential in raw numbers than steel swords or gunpowder. You can try to picture what this looked like inside La Isabela's crowded shelters. Colonists too weak to stand watch, a physician overwhelmed by cases that didn't respond to any treatment available to him, storehouses that had been built to hold gold, and provisions instead being converted, out of necessity, into makeshift sick rooms. Outside the Spanish settlement, in nearby Tano villages, the same fever moved through households that had no European medical tradition to draw on, and no prior experience with anything like it. Whatever the exact mortality rate on either side, and the surviving records are too sparse to give a precise figure, the outbreak was severe enough to be remembered and recorded by chroniclers writing decades later, which tells you it was not a minor, forgettable event even by the standards of a period when disease and death were constant companions to colonial life. The problem is that we cannot know exactly how this outbreak shaped what followed, because the documentary record from 1493 is thin, and because nobody at the time was tracking disease with anything resembling modern epidemiological method. What can be said with more confidence is the broader pattern this outbreak represents. It was the first recorded instance of a phenomenon that historians now call, collectively, the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of diseases, plants, animals and people between the old world and the new, beginning the moment sustained contact began, and continuing in various forms for centuries afterward. That exchange would eventually move in both directions, reshaping diets and economies on both sides of the Atlantic. But its opening chapter, in 1493, moved almost entirely one way, pathogens crossing westward, into populations with no defence against them, while whatever the Americas eventually sent back across the ocean took far longer to register, and never carried anything close to the same. immediate mortality. La Isabella's 1493 fever sits at the very start of that lopsided exchange, not as its most dramatic chapter, but as its opening line. And this is where the story changes in a way that's easy to miss if you're only watching for gold, tribute, and violence. Every chapter so far has focused on things that could be seen, measured, and directly attributed to specific decisions: a fort burned by identifiable attackers, a quota system imposed by an identifiable governor, a population count taken by identifiable Spanish officials. Disease does not work that way. Nobody decided to bring influenza across the Atlantic. Nobody could see it moving between bodies, understand its mechanism, or predict which household it would strike next. It operated invisibly, alongside every other form of violence and extraction already described, compounding their effects in ways that neither side could fully perceive at the time. This matters for understanding the population collapse described in the previous chapter. When historians debate the relative weight of violence, forced labour, and disease in explaining how Hispaniola's Tano population fell from tens of thousands to a few hundred within a generation, the 1493 outbreak is Exhibit A for why disease has to be taken seriously as an independent factor, not merely a footnote to Spanish brutality. It arrived before the encomienda system was formalised. It arrived before the worst of the tribute-related punishments had escalated. It arrived, in other words, almost as soon as sustained contact began, which means it was baked into the earliest possible moment of this history, not a late-stage consequence of a system that had already turned brutal. None of this is to suggest that Spanish policy and Spanish violence were somehow secondary to disease, or that colonial administrators bear less responsibility because a pathogen was also at work. The historical record shows both forces operating together, and untangling their precise relative contributions is, by most historians' own admission, not fully possible given the evidence that survives. What the 1493 outbreak does establish, clearly and early, is that this was never a simple story of conquest by sword and quota alone. From the very beginning, something biological was moving alongside the politics, the violence, and the extraction, and it would not stay contained to one small settlement on one Caribbean island. That first outbreak past, La Isabella's survivors, weakened but not annihilated, continued the colonial project the Spanish crown had funded. But the pattern established in 1493, disease arriving quietly, moving between populations with no regard for who held power, doing damage that nobody at the time could fully track or explain, was a preview of something the historical record would not let this story escape. 25 years later, a different disease, one the Tano had even less capacity to survive, would arrive on these same shores. And this time, it would not stop at La Isabela, or at Hispaniola, or even at the Caribbean. It would travel by trade canoe and by Spanish ship into the heart of an empire whose rulers, in 1493, did not yet know that anything called Spain or Columbus existed at all. An empire with cities larger than most in Europe, temples taller than most European cathedrals, and no idea that the thing most likely to end its independence had already begun its journey across the ocean, hidden inside the bodies of men who didn't yet know they carried it either. Before that story can be told, though, this history has to return to the man at its centre, because while disease was quietly doing its early invisible work, Christopher Columbus's own authority over the colony he had founded was collapsing in a much more visible, much more political way. The governor who had imposed the gold quotas, who had founded La Isabela, who had stood on the ashes of La Navidad and pressed forward anyway, was about to be arrested by his own king. On the morning of August 23rd, 1500, 2 caravels entered the mouth of the Ozama River, near the growing settlement of Santo Domingo. Before the newly arrived commander had even set foot on land, he could see something waiting for him at the water's edge that told him everything he needed to know about the colony he had been sent to investigate. 4 bodies hanging from gallows, left in plain view as a warning to anyone who might consider crossing the men currently in charge. The commander was Francisco de Bobadilla, a a Castilian nobleman and knight of the Order of Calatrava, dispatched by the Spanish crown with full authority as royal investigator and chief justice, a position that gave him power to override the colony's existing government entirely if he judged it necessary. He was not an obvious enemy of Columbus, and in fact had family connections to Columbus's own patrons at court. What he found in those first hours on Hispaniola's coast was enough, on its own, to set the tone for everything that followed, regardless of whatever personal feelings he might have carried into the assignment. The men hanging from those gallows were Spanish colonists, mutineers, in the language of the report he would eventually file, executed on the orders of the colony's governor. That governor was Christopher Columbus. This is where the story most people carry with them. Columbus as celebrated admiral, honoured discoverer, the man whose statue stands in city squares across 2 continents, runs directly into a much harder fact. One that isn't the product of modern reinterpretation or retrospective judgment. It comes from Columbus's own contemporaries, acting under the authority of his own king and queen, within 8 years of his first voyage. By 1500, conditions on Hispaniola under Columbus's governorship had deteriorated so severely, reports of disorder, abuse, and unrest reaching the Spanish court with enough frequency and enough weight that the crown felt compelled to send an investigator with the power to override Columbus's own authority entirely. Bobadilla did not ease into the job. Upon confirming what he found at Santo Domingo, he ordered the arrest of Columbus's brother Diego, who had been left in charge of the settlement in Columbus's absence. He impounded Columbus's papers. He took possession of the town itself. Columbus at the time was travelling elsewhere on the island, by some accounts at La Vega, overseeing operations away from the capital, while his brother Bartholomew was dealing with unrest of his own at Zaragua. When Columbus learned what was happening, he made his way back to Santo Domingo and, by most accounts, surrendered himself without violent resistance. He arrived unattended, walking into the city with whatever dignity the situation allowed him. It did not save him from what came next. Bobadilla's guards met him on the outskirts of town, arrested him and placed him in chains, and lodged him in the very fortress tower whose stones still stand in Santo Domingo today. The detail that follows is almost too vivid to need embellishment. According to accounts from the period, it was Columbus's own cook, a man named Espinosa, who was tasked with riveting the iron shackles onto him. Columbus reportedly experienced this not just as punishment, but as a particular personal humiliation, to be bound not by an enemy or a stranger, but by someone from his own household, someone who had served him meals during 4 years of voyages across an ocean most of Europe still considered impossibly dangerous to cross. He was held in the fortress at Santo Domingo while Bobadilla continued his investigation and prepared to send Columbus and his 2 brothers back across the Atlantic as prisoners, their titles and authority stripped from them pending judgment at court. You have to sit with the reversal this represents. This was not a rival power, a foreign court, or a resentful subordinate acting on personal grievance. This was the Spanish crown itself, the same monarchs who had funded Columbus's voyages, who had granted him titles and a share of any riches the New World produced, concluding that his conduct as governor had crossed a line serious enough to warrant arrest and public humiliation. Columbus waited 7 months in Spain for an audience with the king and queen, all the while refusing to have his chains removed, insisting on presenting himself in them as a form of protest against what he clearly felt was an unjust reversal of his fortunes. According to some accounts, he even requested in his will, years later, that he be buried wearing those same chains. A final, defiant gesture from a man who never fully accepted that his own conduct, and not simply court politics or jealous rivals, had brought him to this point. Held in the fortress at Santo Domingo, Columbus would have had time to reflect on how completely his circumstances had reversed since his triumphant return to Spain after the first voyage, when crowds had gathered to see the man who claimed to have reached the edge of Asia. Now he sat behind stone walls, his correspondence confiscated, his brothers similarly detained, waiting for a ship that would carry him back across the same ocean he had crossed as a celebrated discoverer, this time as a prisoner facing formal inquiry into his conduct. What exactly had Bobadilla found that justified such a dramatic response? For centuries, historians had only fragmentary answers, because the actual investigative report Bobadilla compiled, a lengthy document running to roughly 48 pages, disappeared from the historical record entirely. It resurfaced only in 2006, rediscovered in Spanish archives after being lost, effectively, for 500 years. Its contents, once finally examined by modern historians, proved as damning as the arrest itself suggested. Detailed accounts of abuse, torture, and arbitrary executions carried out under Columbus's administration, painting a picture of a governor whose rule had grown erratic and brutal even by the standards of an already brutal colonial system. The fact that such a document could sit unread in an archive for half a millennium is itself worth pausing on. It means that for most of the last 500 years, the specific documented case against Columbus's governorship was simply unavailable to the historians, teachers, and popular writers who shaped how his story would be told to the wider world. Much of what the public understood about Columbus for centuries was built without access to the very report that first triggered his downfall. This is a detail worth pausing on because it changes how the story of Columbus's downfall should be told. This is not a case of modern critics looking back with 21st century values and judging a 15th century man unfairly by standards he could not have anticipated. This is a case of Columbus's own contemporaries, men operating within the same colonial system, answering to the same crown, sharing many of the same assumptions about conquest and indigenous peoples that Columbus himself held, concluding that what he had done went beyond what even that system was willing to tolerate. The Bobadilla report was not a modern indictment. It was a period document written in 1500 by an investigator sent specifically because Columbus's own government had received too many complaints to ignore. Some of the disorder Bobadilla documented had nothing directly to do with indigenous policy at all. It involved Spanish colonists rebelling against Columbus's own administration, men like Francisco Roldan, who led an uprising against Colombian rule that Columbus struggled for years to fully suppress. Roldan, originally appointed by Columbus himself to a position of local authority, turned against him amid disputes over pay, provisions, and the harsh conditions colonists were expected to endure. Disputes that escalated into armed factionalism among the Spanish themselves, with rival bands of colonists at times more concerned with settling scores against each other than with the colony's stated mission. Personal rivalries, disputes over women, disputes over authority, and disputes over the distribution of what little wealth the colony had actually produced, all fed into a picture of governance that had, by 1500, become genuinely chaotic. One episode, recorded by chroniclers of the period, describes a rebel named Hernando de Guevara, executed in a hurry and thrown from a fort's walls amid the factional infighting, a detail that illustrates just how far colonial order had frayed even among the Spanish themselves, independent of anything happening to the Tano. Columbus was not simply a brutal administrator toward the Tano, though the tribute system and its punishments described in earlier chapters speak for themselves on that front. He was also, by the account of his own investigator, failing to govern his own Spanish subjects effectively, to the point where public hangings had become a tool for maintaining order rather than a last resort. Columbus's story did not end with his arrest, though his authority over Hispaniola effectively did. He eventually secured an audience with Ferdinand and Isabella, who restored some of his personal honours and, remarkably, permitted him a fourth and final voyage across the Atlantic between 1502 and 1504, a voyage during which he would be shipwrecked for over a year on the coast of Jamaica, at one point reportedly using his knowledge of an approaching lunar eclipse to convince wary local inhabitants to keep supplying his stranded crew. He never regained the governorship that had been stripped from him. He died in 1506, a wealthy man by the standards of his era, but not the singular authority over the new world he had once imagined himself becoming. For decades afterward, he went largely unmentioned in serious historical writing, a detail that complicates the modern image of Columbus as an uncontested hero, since that image is, in large part, a much later invention, constructed centuries after his death to serve purposes that had little to do with the actual, messy, documented record of his governorship. None of this halted the system Columbus had helped set in motion. If anything, his arrest and removal marked a turning point of a different kind, not an end to exploitation on Hispaniola, but the beginning of its formalization under new leadership. The chaos Bobadilla had documented was, in its own way, a symptom of an improvised, personally run colonial project without clear institutional structure, where one man's judgment, temper and ambition had been allowed to shape policy toward tens of thousands of people with almost no oversight, and where the line between governing a colony and simply ruling it by personal whim had nearly disappeared. What came next would replace that improvisation with something more organised, more bureaucratic, and, in practice, no less devastating for the people it governed. A new governor was already being prepared for the crossing, carrying with him a mandate to bring order to Hispaniola and over 2,000 settlers to help him do it, and the tool he would use to impose that order would soon carry an official name, one that would define Spanish colonial labour policy across the Caribbean and eventually the mainland for the next half-century. In 1502, a fleet of 30 ships dropped anchor off Hispaniola, carrying roughly 2,500 Spanish settlers, by far the largest single wave of colonisation the island had yet seen, dwarfing anything Columbus himself had ever brought across the Atlantic. At the head of that fleet stood Nicolas de Ovando, the newly appointed governor sent to replace the chaos Bobadilla had documented with something the Spanish crown hoped would look, at last, like order. Among the ships were supplies, tools, livestock and settlers of every trade, farmers, soldiers, clergy, administrators, arriving with the expectation that Hispaniola's earlier disorder had simply been a matter of poor leadership, now corrected by a competent replacement. Ovando's arrival is often framed, in the surviving Spanish administrative record, as a reset, a chance to correct the mistakes of Columbus's improvised, personally run colony and establish a functioning, sustainable system of governance. On paper, that is exactly what it looked like. Ovando brought settlers, supplies and a mandate to organise labour, resource extraction, and indigenous relations under clearer rules than anything Columbus had managed to establish. What Ovando actually built within the span of a single year was the formal encomienda system, a structure that would define Spanish colonial labour practices not just on Hispaniola, but eventually across Mexico, Peru, and the rest of Spanish America for the next several decades. The word itself derives from the Spanish verb encomenda, to entrust, a governor entrusting a Spanish settler with the care, protection and conversion of an assigned indigenous community, in exchange for that community's labour and tribute. The language of trust and care sat, from the very beginning, uneasily alongside the reality of what the system actually demanded. Here is where the reform framing runs into trouble, and where the evidence suggests something more troubling than simple administrative competence at work. The encomienda, as Ovando formalised it, assigned entire Tano communities to individual Spanish settlers, who received both the labour and the tribute of the people under their control in exchange for a nominal obligation to provide military protection and Christian instruction. In practice, that obligation was rarely honoured with anything close to the seriousness of the labour extraction it was meant to justify. What had existed informally under Columbus, tribute quotas enforced through threat and punishment, now had an official name, a legal structure, and the full backing of colonial administration. Formalisation did not soften the system, it scaled it. If you had stood on a dock at Santo Domingo in 1502, watching Ovando's fleet unload its settlers, tools and livestock, you would have seen what looked, on the surface, like the arrival of civilization itself: priests disembarking alongside farmers, crates of Spanish goods stacked along the waterfront, a sense of purpose and organisation that Columbus's earlier, improvised colony had visibly lacked. You would not have seen, at least not yet, the legal grants being drawn up in the governor's new headquarters that would formally bind entire Tano villages to individual Spanish landholders, nor the ships already being planned to bring the first enslaved Africans across the Atlantic within the same year. The order Ovando brought was real. It was also, from its very first months, order in service of an extraction machine that showed no sign of slowing down. You can picture the machinery of Encomienda physically, sugar plantations expanding along the coast, their boiling houses generating heat that workers described as unbearable even by tropical standards, giant grinding wheels crushing cane stalks, and with grim regularity. The limbs of the men and women forced to operate them, according to accounts recorded by contemporaries who witnessed the injuries firsthand. Gold mines deeper inland, where the labour demands first established under Columbus's tribute system continued, now organised under encomienda grants that assigned specific numbers of workers to specific Spanish landholders, with overseers tracking output against quotas the way earlier tribute collectors had tracked gold dust and cotton. This was not a new kind of exploitation. It was the same exploitation, given legal shape, expanded in scale, and administered with the kind of institutional consistency that Columbus's chaotic governorship had never achieved. Encomenderos, the Spanish settlers who held these grants, were technically required to provide for the well-being and religious instruction of the people assigned to them. In the surviving record, that obligation appears far more often as a legal formality invoked to justify the system's existence than as a practice consistently observed on the ground. And arriving with Ovando's fleet was something else entirely new to this story. Roughly 100 enslaved Africans, brought specifically to supplement a Tano labour force that Spanish administrators could already see was shrinking. This detail matters enormously, and it's easy to let it pass by too quickly. The very same population collapse described in earlier chapters, the fall from tens of thousands toward a few hundred, driven by disease, violence and forced labour, was already visible enough to Spanish administrators in 1502 that they responded not by easing the demands on Hispaniola's indigenous population, but by importing an entirely new enslaved population to make up the shortfall. The system's response to watching the people it depended on disappear was not restraint. It was expansion, onto a new group of human beings entirely, transported across an ocean specifically to keep the same extractive machine running at full capacity. Ovando himself, within months of these Africans' arrival, complained in writing to King Ferdinand that some of the enslaved men had fled among the Indians, adopting what he called bad customs and proving difficult to recapture. That complaint is worth sitting with, because it reveals something the encomienda system's own architects hadn't fully anticipated. The Africans and Tano people forced into this same colonial machine did not necessarily see each other as separate, unrelated populations with nothing in common. Some found common cause, common resistance, and common refuge in each other. From the very earliest years of African enslavement in the Americas, a detail that complicates any simple narrative of separate, isolated victim populations and points instead towards shared resistance emerging almost immediately, even under a system designed explicitly to keep enslaved and forced labourers isolated and controllable. Later decades would see this same pattern recur again and again across the Caribbean and mainland Spanish America, enslaved Africans and indigenous people finding each other across the boundaries the colonial system tried to enforce between them. The scale of what Ovando organised becomes clearer when you consider the numbers involved. Encomienda grants under his administration and its immediate successors assigned Tano labourers in blocks ranging from a few dozen to several hundred per Spanish grantee, with the largest encomenderos controlling labour forces comparable in size to entire villages. Colonial account books from this period, fragmentary as they are, record tribute in gold, cotton, and foodstuffs flowing from these assigned communities to their Spanish overseers on a regular schedule, the same basic accounting logic that had governed Columbus's earlier, less formal quota system, now simply given the weight of law and bureaucratic record-keeping behind it. The problem is that we cannot know exactly how many separate encomienda grants existed on Hispaniola at the height of Ovando's governorship, because the surviving administrative record is incomplete and scattered across archives that were not always carefully preserved. What can be said with more confidence is the direction of travel, a system that had begun as an improvised, personally enforced tribute demand under Columbus had, within a decade of first contact, become a codified, empire-wide institution, one flexible enough to be exported, largely intact, to every new territory the Spanish crown would go on to claim. This is also the period in which the moral cost of the encomienda system began to generate its first serious internal Spanish opposition, not from indigenous resistance, which had been ongoing since Columbus's earliest voyages, but from within the Spanish colonial and religious establishment itself. Dominican friars newly arrived on the island, observing the conditions under Ovando's formalized system, began raising concerns that would, within a decade, erupt into public condemnation from the pulpit itself. One of those friars, a young man who would later become the system's most forceful critic, arrived on Hispaniola in this very period as a settler himself, participating in the same colonial economy he would eventually spend the rest of his life working to dismantle. A detail that complicates any easy division between villains and reformers in this story, since some of the most consequential opposition to the encomienda came from men who had, at least for a time, benefited directly from it. That opposition would take a few more years to fully form, but its roots traced directly back to what these friars witnessed in the earliest years of Ovando's governorship, a labour system that had industrialised rather than reduced the exploitation Columbus had begun. At first, the tempting way to read Ovando's arrival is as an improvement, a competent administrator replacing a chaotic one, order replacing disorder, structure replacing improvisation. Others remain cautious about this framing, and for good reason. The evidence suggests that whatever administrative competence Ovando brought to Hispaniola, he applied it toward making the extraction of labour and tribute more efficient, more comprehensive, and more resistant to the kind of individual complaints and rebellions that had plagued Columbus's tenure. The physical record shows sugar production increasing, mining operations expanding, and the encomienda grants becoming a foundational institution of Spanish colonial economy, one that would outlast Ovando himself by decades and eventually spread far beyond this one island, carried by later conquistadors into Mexico, Central America, and the Andes as the same basic template for organising conquered populations. What can be said with more confidence is where all of this was heading. Ovando had, in the span of roughly a year, built the legal and administrative scaffolding for a system that would extract labour from indigenous populations across the entire Spanish Empire in the Americas for generations, long after his own governorship ended, and long after Hispaniola itself had ceased to be the centre of Spanish colonial attention. He had also demonstrated, through the importation of the first enslaved Africans, that when one exploited population began to disappear faster than the colonial economy could tolerate, the system's answer was not to reduce its demands, but to widen its search for people to meet them, a logic that would repeat itself at even greater scale as Spanish colonization expanded into Mexico and South America in the decades that followed. None of this had yet reached its most brutal expression. That still lay ahead, in a single afternoon at a festival meant to celebrate friendship between the Spanish and one of Hispaniola's most powerful remaining indigenous leaders, a woman who had, unlike so many other caciques before her, chosen diplomacy over resistance, and who was about to discover that choice offered no protection at all. In 1503, drums and song filled a large gathering hall in the territory of Zaragua on the southwestern side of Hispaniola. Cacica Anacauna, ruler of this territory since her brother Bohecho's death 3 years earlier, had organised a festival in honour of Governor Nicholas de Ovando, who had travelled to Zaragua with several hundred men to accept her hospitality. Tano performers filled the hall with aretos, ceremonial ballads and narrative songs, some of them composed by Anacauna herself, welcoming the Spanish governor as an honoured guest. Caciques from surrounding villages had gathered as well, drawn by the occasion and by Anacauna's standing as one of the most respected remaining indigenous leaders on the island, filling the Beatty, the large communal structure at the centre of the celebration, with the kind of ceremony reserved for genuine diplomatic occasions rather than routine tribute collection. Some had travelled considerable distances to attend, a sign of how significant this gathering was meant to be within the remaining network of Tano leadership on the island. This was not a hostile encounter. It was, by every surviving account, precisely the opposite. A demonstration of goodwill from a leader who had consistently chosen cooperation over armed resistance. Zaragua, unlike other regions of Hispaniola, had not been fully subdued by Spanish military force. Its people continued to pay tribute, but they retained a degree of autonomy that made Zaragua something closer to an uneasy ally than a conquered territory. Anacaona herself was described by Spain's own early chroniclers, including Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, Hispaniola's first official historian, as courteous, eloquent, and genuinely well-disposed toward the Spanish. A description that makes what happened next even harder to reconcile with any framework of justified retaliation or military necessity. Here is the contradiction that sits at the centre of this chapter, and it's one of the starkest reversals in this entire history. Cooperation, in this case, offered no protection whatsoever. According to the account of Bartolomé de las Casas, who was present on Hispaniola during this period and later documented the episode in detail, Ovando's men turned on their hosts in the middle of the festivities. Accounts describe Ovando enticing the assembled caciques into the Beatty under the pretense of a tournament or demonstration for their entertainment, only for armed Spaniards, positioned in advance to close in on signal. Somewhere between 40 and 80 Tano caciques and nobles, the exact number varies across surviving accounts, were seized, herded into a structure and killed, with some accounts describing the building itself being set alight with people still inside. Outside, in the wider gathering, Spanish soldiers moved through the crowd of ordinary attendees, and chroniclers describe a chaotic scene of flight and slaughter extending well beyond the noble leadership initially targeted. Anacaona was taken into custody, transported under guard to Santo Domingo, held for a period awaiting what passed for a trial, and ultimately hanged. At first, the explanation Spanish officials offered was that the gathering concealed a planned uprising, that Anacaona and her allied caciques intended to use the festival as cover for a coordinated attack against Ovando and his men. This is the tempting, self-justifying version of events, the one that transforms a massacre into a preemptive defensive action, and it is the version that made its way most readily into official Spanish correspondence sent back across the Atlantic. Various reasons have been proposed by historians for why Ovando may have acted as he did, and the conspiracy narrative is one of them, but it rests almost entirely on Spanish testimony gathered after the fact, from men who had every incentive to frame their own actions as justified self-defense rather than calculated slaughter. Some historians have proposed alternative motives entirely, that Ovando viewed any independent indigenous authority, however cooperative, as an obstacle to full Spanish control of the island's remaining resources and labour, and that the alleged conspiracy served primarily as a convenient pretext for eliminating that obstacle once and for all. The physical and circumstantial evidence complicates the self-justifying account considerably. Zaragua had a long-standing reputation, even among the Spanish, as one of the more cooperative and least militarily hostile regions of Hispaniola. Anacaona had personally hosted Ovando's predecessors' representatives before, and her willingness to organise an elaborate, costly festival specifically in Ovando's honour, one requiring weeks of preparation, the gathering of dozens of allied caciques, and significant expenditure of the community's resources, is difficult to square with simultaneous plans to ambush him. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Whatever threat Ovando claimed to be neutralising, his response was disproportionate to any documented Tano military capacity at the time, and it fell most heavily on precisely the caciques who had positioned themselves as the most cooperative, least resistant leadership remaining on the island. You have to sit with what this means for the larger pattern building across this history. Every chapter so far has shown Spanish colonial policy demanding compliance, tribute, labour, conversion, submission, in exchange for at least the implicit promise of survival and some degree of continued autonomy. Zaragua had, more than perhaps any other territory on Hispaniola, actually delivered that compliance. It paid tribute. It avoided armed confrontation. Its leader hosted Spanish officials with genuine warmth, by the Spanish's own account, going so far as to compose music in their honour. And it was destroyed anyway, its leadership eliminated in a single coordinated action, on the same afternoon it had organised to celebrate friendship with the very men who would kill it. If you had been one of the caciques gathered in that Beatty, watching the performance you had helped arrange, you would have had no reason, based on everything Zaraigua had done to maintain peace, to expect anything other than a continuation of the uneasy but functional relationship that had existed for years. This is where the knowledge twist of this chapter lands hardest. The old assumption running through much of Hispaniola's colonial history was that cooperation offered a path to relative safety, however diminished, while resistance guaranteed violent suppression. Zaraigua's destruction breaks that assumption completely. If the most cooperative Tano polity remaining on the island could be eliminated on a pretext, then the entire logical structure Tano leaders might have used to guide their strategy, comply to survive, resist and risk destruction, collapses entirely. There was, in the end, no strategy that guaranteed safety. Ovando's actions at Zaraigua demonstrated, in the starkest possible terms, that Spanish colonial power on Hispaniola was not actually negotiating the terms of coexistence with indigenous leadership. It was eliminating any independent centre of indigenous authority that remained, regardless of that authority's conduct, regardless of tribute paid, regardless of hospitality offered. The verses attributed to Anacaona from her imprisonment, recorded by later chroniclers, speak to exactly this recognition. In them she reflects that killing brings no honour, and that even enemies deserve, in death, the dignity of being remembered rather than erased. A sentiment that, whether or not it captures her exact words, reflects the way her memory would go on to function in Caribbean historical consciousness for centuries afterward, as a symbol of dignity destroyed by treachery rather than defeated in fair contest. Whether these words represent her precise sentiments or a later literary reconstruction shaped by sympathetic writers is something historians cannot fully verify. The documentary chain between Anacaona's actual imprisonment and the surviving verses passes through multiple retellings, translations, and centuries of retelling by writers with their own artistic and political motivations. What can be said with more confidence is that her execution and the massacre that preceded it became one of the most remembered atrocities of the entire Spanish colonial period in the Caribbean, cited by later critics of the encomienda system, including Las Casas himself, as a defining example of the gap between Spanish justification and Spanish conduct. The scale of the killing at Zaraigua also matters in the context of the population collapse described earlier in this history. 40 to 80 caciques and nobles does not sound, in isolation, like a catastrophic number against a population that had once numbered in the tens of thousands. But cacique leadership in Tano society was not simply symbolic. It represented an entire structure of governance, ceremony, land management, and inherited authority, passed down through specific family lines and reinforced through ritual and public performance of exactly the kind Anacaona had organised for this festival. Eliminating dozens of leaders in a single afternoon did not just kill individuals. It severed the leadership structures that might otherwise have coordinated resistance, negotiated terms, or organised the kind of collective response that had, in earlier years, at least occasionally slowed Spanish expansion into new territories. A society that loses its accumulated leadership, ceremonial knowledge, and diplomatic experience in a single afternoon is not simply smaller afterward. It is structurally different, less capable of the kind of coordinated response that might have altered what followed. None of this happened in isolation from everything already described in this history. It came after a decade of tribute demands, forced labour, disease, and administrative reorganisation under Ovando's new encomienda system. Zaraigua's destruction was not a single, isolated atrocity standing apart from the rest of the colonial project. It was the logical endpoint of a system that had, from its earliest days at La Navidad, treated indigenous cooperation as something to be extracted and exploited rather than something to be honoured on its own terms. And Ovando's willingness to eliminate an entire cooperative leadership structure on a pretext fits that pattern precisely, rather than standing apart from it as an aberration. Word of what happened at Zaragua spread inevitably to other parts of the island and beyond it, carried by traders, by refugees, and by the Spanish themselves, who did not treat the massacre as something requiring secrecy. Not every remaining Tano leader responded the same way. Some continued attempting negotiation, having no better alternative available and no reason to believe flight or resistance would fare any better. Others concluded, correctly, that negotiation offered no real protection at all, and at least one cacique, having witnessed or heard directly of what had happened to Anacaona's people, decided that his best remaining option was not to fight and not to comply, but to run, carrying a warning as far as he could across open water to people who had not yet learned what the Spanish arrival actually meant for those who welcomed them. Around 1511, a cacique named Hatui led roughly 400 people across the Windward Passage, the stretch of open water separating Hispaniola from Cuba, in a fleet of canoes carrying not just his followers, but in a sense a warning that had not yet been spoken aloud. He was not fleeing towards safety in any conventional sense. He was fleeing toward a warning he intended to deliver in person, to people who had not yet experienced what he and his followers had already lived through. Hatui ruled the Cachicazgo of Guahab, in territory that had witnessed, directly or by close report, the tribute demands, the labour exploitation, and the massacres already described in this history, including, by the time of his departure, the destruction at Zaragua, an event that would have been known across the island's remaining indigenous communities within months, given how openly the Spanish had treated it. By the time he made the crossing to Cuba, Spanish forces had not yet begun their formal conquest of that island. It remained, for the moment, outside the reach of the encomienda system and the colonial administration Ovando had built on Hispaniola. Hatui's goal was to reach the indigenous communities there before the Spanish did, and to convince them that armed resistance, however difficult, was preferable to whatever accommodation the newcomers might offer. The account of what Hatui told those communities comes to us through Bartolomé de las Casas, who recorded it as testimony rather than as something he witnessed directly. According to that account, Hatui gathered the people of Cuba and asked them a question before he offered any warning at all. Did they know why the Christians, as he called the Spanish, behaved as they did? When the assembled people answered that they did not, beyond assuming the newcomers were simply cruel by nature, Hatui offered a different explanation. He told them the Spanish worshipped a god they loved above all things, and that their devotion to that god was precisely what drove them to subjugate other peoples, to conquer in order to convert, and to justify almost any cruelty as service to that larger purpose. He reportedly showed those gathered a basket of gold and jewels he had brought with him, explaining that it was gold, more than anything else, that the Spanish actually served, with religions serving as the language used to justify taking it. The image of the basket of gold is worth sitting with a moment longer, because it captures something the rest of this history has already shown in different forms. The tribute quotas at La Isabela, the encomienda grants under Ovando, the massacre at Zaragua, all of it circling back to the same underlying motive. Hatui had lived inside a system built around that motive for years by the time he reached Cuba, and his warning to a population that had not yet experienced any of it was, in effect, a compressed retelling of everything this history has documented so far, delivered not as abstract history, but as urgent, first-person testimony from someone who had watched it happen and had no reason left to expect anything different from what was coming next. Hatui's message to the Cubans was not naive. It was a specific, reasoned analysis of Spanish motivation and behaviour, built from direct observation on Hispaniola, delivered as a deliberate act of cross-island political organising carried out well before any Spanish soldier had set foot on Cuban soil. He was not simply fleeing. He was trying to change the outcome for an entire population that had not yet made contact with the colonisers at all, using the clearest tool available to him, first-hand testimony from someone who had already lived through what was coming. His resistance, once Spanish forces under Diego Velázquez began their formal conquest of Cuba, took the form of guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run attacks followed by retreat into difficult terrain, then regrouping for the next engagement, a strategy that relied on intimate knowledge of the landscape, and a refusal to meet Spanish forces in the kind of open confrontation where their armour, steel weapons and horses gave them the greatest advantage. This strategy kept Spanish forces pinned down and, by some accounts, genuinely afraid, unable to leave their fortified position at Baracoa for a period of roughly 3 months. That detail matters because it shows Hatuey's resistance was not merely symbolic or doomed from the outset. It was tactically effective for a meaningful stretch of time against an enemy that had already demonstrated overwhelming advantages in weaponry, armour, and organised military structure on Hispaniola. What ultimately ended Hatuey's resistance was not superior Spanish tactics in open battle. It was betrayal. A traitor, according to surviving accounts, revealed the location of Hatuey's forces to Velázquez's men, allowing them to surround and capture him without the costly direct engagement his guerrilla tactics had successfully avoided for months. Some accounts suggest the betrayal came from within his own following, a detail that, if accurate, speaks to the impossible pressure guerrilla resistance placed on the communities sustaining it, hunger, exhaustion, and the promise of Spanish leniency in exchange for cooperation eventually proving more persuasive to at least one person than continued loyalty to a cause that offered no clear path to lasting victory. This detail deserves attention because it reframes what Spanish victory actually meant in practice, again and again across this history. From La Navidad's uncertain end to Zaragoza's massacre to Hatuey's capture, Spanish success in these episodes did not come primarily from battlefield superiority against organised resistance. It came from betrayal, deception, and the exploitation of divisions, real or manufactured, within and between indigenous communities. On February 2, 1512, Hatuey was tied to a stake near what is now the town of Yara in Cuba's Granma province and sentenced to be burned alive. Before the fire was lit, a Franciscan friar present at the execution offered him a final choice, framed in the language of Christian salvation: accept baptism, and he would go to heaven; refuse, and he would be condemned to hell for eternity. This was, by the standards of the time, presented as an act of mercy, a last chance at spiritual rescue extended even to a condemned enemy combatant. Las Casas recorded what followed as testimony passed to him, not as something he personally witnessed, and the exchange has become one of the most repeated moments in Caribbean colonial history. Hatuey, according to this account, thought for a moment and then asked the friar a direct question: did Spaniards go to heaven? The friar answered that good Christians did. Hatuey's response, as recorded by Las Casas, was immediate and unambiguous. He wanted nothing to do with heaven then. If it meant spending eternity in the company of people capable of what he had witnessed, he would rather go to hell, he said, so as not to be near such cruel people ever again. It is one of the starkest recorded rejections of the entire colonial religious framework offered anywhere in this history. Not a rejection of faith in the abstract, but a specific, reasoned refusal built on direct, lived experience of what the people offering that faith had actually done. It is worth being careful here about what this exchange represents and what it does not. This is not a verified transcript. It comes down to us through a single chronicler, writing with clear sympathy for Hatuey's cause and clear intent to use the episode as evidence in his broader campaign against the encomienda system and Spanish colonial cruelty. That context doesn't mean the exchange is fabricated. Las Casas was, by this point in his life, deeply embedded in documenting exactly this kind of colonial violence, and had personal access to first-hand accounts from Cuba during this period. But it does mean the specific wording should be understood as recorded testimony, shaped by decades of retelling and by Las Casas's own literary and political purposes, rather than a word-for-word court record. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Hatuey died at the stake on that date. In that place, having spent his final months trying to warn an entire population about a threat most of them had not yet directly experienced. You can picture the scene without needing embellishment: smoke rising against a Caribbean sky, a Franciscan cross held up in offer, and a captured leader's calm, deliberate refusal of the only escape being offered him. because that escape required accepting the worldview of the people who had destroyed everything he had tried to protect. Hatuey's death did not end indigenous resistance in Cuba, though it removed one of its most capable early organisers. Cuba would be fully absorbed into the same colonial and encomienda structure already established on Hispaniola within a matter of years, and the population effects would follow a broadly similar trajectory to what had happened on the larger island: tribute demands, forced labour. Disease and demographic collapse repeating themselves on new ground, following the same basic pattern this history has already traced from La Navidad forward. Hatuey is remembered today, particularly in Cuba, as the first national hero of that country's long history of resistance to outside domination. A monument at Baracoa commemorates him specifically as a precursor to Cuban liberty. More than 3 centuries before the independence movements that would eventually follow, his image and story invoked by later generations of Cuban revolutionaries as an early symbol of resistance to foreign domination in any form. But the deeper problem this chapter reveals is not really about Hatuey's individual fate, however striking it remains on its own terms. It is about what his failure demonstrates regarding the limits of foresight and resistance against what was coming. Hatuey saw the pattern clearly. He organised in advance, with real strategic clarity, against an adversary most of his audience had never encountered. He fought effectively for months. And it still was not enough. If accurate warning, effective guerrilla tactics, and months of successful resistance could not stop this process, then something larger than any single leader's courage or cleverness was driving events forward. Something that would soon reveal itself as far more effective at destroying entire populations than any army Spain had yet deployed in the Caribbean. It required no swords, no betrayal, and no strategy at all. It simply needed a ship, a port, and enough time to travel inland, and it was already on its way. In December of 1518, in the gold mines of Hispaniola, enslaved African labourers began showing symptoms that Spanish colonists had never before witnessed on the island: raised pustules covering the skin, high fever, and a mortality rate that quickly outpaced anything the influenza outbreak of 1493 had produced. This was smallpox, and its arrival marks the moment this history's central biological thread, quietly introduced 25 years earlier at La Isabela, reached its full, devastating potential. Spanish physicians on the island, working from the limited medical understanding available in this period, could describe the visible symptoms but had no framework for containing the outbreak once it began moving between the mines, the settlements, and the shrinking Tano communities still living nearby. By May of 1519, roughly 1/3 of Hispaniola's remaining Tano population had died from this outbreak alone. Given how catastrophically small that population had already become by this point, reduced, as earlier chapters have shown, from tens of thousands toward a few hundred over the preceding decades, this final blow effectively completed a demographic collapse that had been building since the earliest years of Spanish contact. The disease did not stop there. It spread to Cuba, where Hatuey's countrymen were still absorbing the aftermath of his execution just years earlier, and to Puerto Rico, where it killed roughly half of the indigenous populations on those islands within a comparable span of time, moving along the same trade and administrative routes that connected Spain's growing Caribbean colonial network. Here is where this story stops being a Caribbean story and becomes something far larger. Smallpox reached the Yucatan Peninsula on the Mexican mainland by 1518, likely carried by indigenous trade canoes moving between islands and coastal territories, along routes that had existed long before Columbus's arrival and that the Spanish themselves had not yet fully mapped or controlled. This detail matters enormously because it means the disease that would go on to help topple the largest empire in the Americas arrived there ahead of any Spanish soldier, travelling through indigenous trade networks rather than Spanish ships, in a route historians continue to debate the precise details of, given how thin and scattered the surviving documentary evidence is. Some accounts trace the mainland outbreak to a specific individual, a man sometimes identified in later sources as Francisco Egua or Francisco de Bagua, a member of a Spanish expedition under Panfilo de Narvaez sent to confront courts in 1520. But the epidemiological reality is broader than any single carrier. By the time Kortz's own campaign began, the disease was already established on the mainland through multiple points of contact, spreading independently of any one person's movements. Herrn Kortz landed at Veracruz in April of 1519, beginning the campaign that would eventually bring down the Aztec Empire and its capital, Tenochtitlan, a city that, by contemporary Spanish accounts, rivaled or exceeded the largest cities of Europe in population, organisation and architectural sophistication, built on a lake and connected to the mainland by a network of causeways that impressed even the most sceptical Spanish observers. At the time of his landing, smallpox was already present on the mainland, moving ahead of his own forces through populations that had never encountered it and carried no immunity whatsoever. By the autumn of 1520, during the height of Kortz's siege of Tenochtitlan, the disease reached the city itself, and its effects were catastrophic. Modern historians estimate roughly 40% mortality within the city during that outbreak, striking a population already under military siege, already cut off from reliable food and water. And now facing a pathogen its healers had no framework for treating. The Florentine Codex, compiled decades later by Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún, working with Nahua informants who had lived through the siege, describes the disease in vivid, specific terms: sores covering the body so thickly that the afflicted could not lie down in comfort, and so many dead that the living could not keep pace with burying them. This is the point where the old assumption this chapter needs to break becomes clear. Kortz's conquest of the Aztec Empire is remembered, in popular telling, as a triumph of Spanish military audacity and technological superiority over a vastly larger indigenous force, a few hundred Spanish soldiers, against an empire of millions, somehow prevailing through sheer boldness and steel weaponry. That version leaves out something the documentary and epidemiological record makes clear. The empire Kortz was fighting had already been weakened by a pathogen that had travelled ahead of him by more than a year. Striking a population with no prior exposure and no capacity to build the kind of partial resistance that had allowed European populations to survive centuries of periodic smallpox. Outbreaks, generation after generation, through a slow accumulation of immunity that Mesoamerican populations had never had the opportunity to develop. The scholarly article that first laid out this connection in detail, published in 1967 in the Hispanic American Historical Review under the title Conquistador y Pestilencia, argued that the epidemic was a decisive factor in the fall of Tenochtitlan, not because disease alone defeated the Aztec military, but because it struck at a moment when the city was already under siege. When its leadership structure was already strained by the recent death of the Emperor Cuitlahuac, himself reportedly a victim of the same epidemic, and when its capacity to mount a sustained defence depended on exactly the kind of healthy, mobile population that smallpox was actively destroying. This argument does not erase the importance of Kortz's own strategy, particularly his alliance with the Tlaxcalans and other indigenous groups who had their own long-standing grievances against Aztec imperial rule, and who provided the overwhelming majority of the manpower in the actual siege of Tenochtitlan, tens of thousands of allied warriors, against a Spanish force that numbered, at its peak, only in the hundreds. What the epidemic argument does is complicate the simple story of Spanish military genius overcoming impossible odds through willpower and steel alone. You have to sit with what this means for how Spanish victory gets remembered across this entire history. From La Navidad's uncertain end, through Zaragoza's massacre, through Hatui's betrayal, and now through the fall of an empire whose rulers had never even heard the word Spain until months before their own capital's collapse, the pattern holds. European success in this era of conquest was rarely a matter of superior civilization overcoming inferior civilization in fair contest. It was, again and again, a matter of disease, division, and betrayal doing work that European weapons alone could not have accomplished, dressed up afterward in the language of destiny and superior character. The scale of what happened next, beyond Tenochtitlan itself, deserves attention too. A second wave of the same smallpox epidemic, moving through Mesoamerica between 1520 and 1521, reached the Guatemalan highlands and struck the Cachiquel Maya population with similarly devastating effect, killing, by some estimates, roughly half of that population before the Spanish conquistador Pedro de Alvarado's forces had even physically arrived in the region to begin their own campaign of conquest there, which would not occur until 1523 and 1524. This detail is worth sitting with directly. An entire highland civilization with its own cities, its own written records, and its own long history entirely independent of the Aztec Empire to its north, was already reeling from mass death caused by a disease that had travelled ahead of any Spanish soldier, years before those soldiers actually appeared on Cachiquel land. When Alvarado's forces finally did arrive, they were in effect conquering populations and political structures that disease had already substantially weakened, in a pattern that by this point had repeated itself across 3 separate regions: Hispaniola, central Mexico, and highland Guatemala, each following a broadly similar sequence of disease arrival, demographic collapse, and subsequent military conquest. Some demographic estimates suggest the highland Maya population did not recover to pre-conquest levels until well into the 20th century, a recovery timeline measured not in decades but in centuries, a scale of loss that is difficult to hold in mind against the comparatively brief span of years in which the initial collapse occurred. What can be said with confidence, and what historians broadly agree on, is that disease was not the sole cause of Spanish success across Mesoamerica during this period. Political fractures within the Aztec tribute empire, resentment among subject peoples eager to see Tenochtitlan's dominance ended, Cortes' own tactical decisions, and superior Spanish weaponry and horses all played significant roles that cannot be reduced to epidemiology alone. Some historians emphasize the political fractures more heavily, arguing that the Aztec tribute system had already generated enough resentment among subject peoples that Cortes' alliance building would likely have succeeded even without the epidemic's assistance, simply on a longer timeline. What is equally clear, and increasingly emphasized by modern historians working with both documentary and epidemiological evidence, is that disease was not a minor footnote to this story either. It was present at the decisive moments, weakening populations at precisely the times when resistance depended most on physical strength and numbers. And it arrived through routes and timelines that had nothing to do with any single Spanish military decision. This is also where the arc of this entire history reveals its full shape. What began with 39 men and a burned fort on a single Caribbean beach in 1493 had within 30 years become a hemispheric catastrophe, reaching an empire whose scale, sophistication, and population dwarfed anything the Spanish had yet encountered on Hispaniola, delivered there not primarily by Spanish soldiers, but by a pathogen that had been quietly circulating through the Caribbean since the very earliest years of contact. The chain connecting La Navidad's ashes to Tenochtitlan's fall is not a metaphor. It runs through documented trade routes, documented outbreak dates, and documented population figures, tracing a single continuous biological and colonial process that no single person on either side of the Atlantic planned or fully understood while it was happening. Columbus himself had been dead for over a decade by the time smallpox reached Tenochtitlan, and nothing in the surviving record suggests he or anyone else involved in the earliest years of this history ever grasped the full scale of what their arrival at La Navidad had eventually set in motion. One man had been present, in various capacities, for much of this unfolding catastrophe, a former encomienda holder turned fierce critic of the very system that had made him wealthy, a Dominican friar who had witnessed the worst of what this history has documented, from the tribute demands and massacres on Hispaniola to the demographic collapse that followed, and who was, by this point, preparing to put all of it into words that would eventually reach the highest levels of Spanish government itself. In 1542, Bartolomé de las Casas presented a manuscript to Emperor Charles V of Spain. He called it Brevissima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias, a short account of the destruction of the Indies. It was 50 years, almost to the point, since a fleet of Spanish ships had returned to a quiet Caribbean coastline to find a burned fort and 39 missing men. The document Las Casas placed in front of the most powerful monarch in Europe was the first attempt by anyone to gather the full scope of what had happened across that half-century into a single, sustained accusation aimed not at a foreign enemy, but at the conduct of Spain's own colonial subjects across an entire hemisphere. Las Casas was, by this point, uniquely positioned to make that case. He had arrived on Hispaniola himself as a young man, around the turn of the 16th century, participating for a time in the same encomienda system this history has documented in detail, holding, by his own later admission, indigenous labourers under his own charge before experiencing what he would describe as a moral conversion around 1514, after which he renounced his own encomienda and dedicated the remainder of his long life to opposing the system he had once profited from. He was present, in various capacities, for many of the events this history has already traced. He wrote of Saragua, he recorded Hatioy's final words, he witnessed the tail end of the population collapse on Hispaniola firsthand, and he corresponded with colonists and clergy across the Caribbean, and eventually the mainland as Spanish conquest expanded further. This detail matters, and it complicates any tendency to sort this history neatly into villains and heroes. One of the most consequential critics of Spanish colonial cruelty had for years been a direct participant in it, a fact Las Casas himself acknowledged with evident discomfort in his later writing. The document he presented to Charles V did not mince language. It described massacres, forced labour, mutilation and demographic collapse across Hispaniola, Cuba and the broader Caribbean, drawing on decades of first-hand observation and testimony gathered from colonists, clergy and, where possible, indigenous survivors themselves. It named specific atrocities, including episodes closely resembling the Zaragua massacre and the broader pattern of violence against caciques who had attempted peaceful accommodation with Spanish authority. Las Casas argued, forcefully, that the entire encomienda system was both a moral catastrophe and ultimately self-defeating, destroying the very labour force the Spanish colonial economy depended on for its long-term survival. The immediate result of this campaign was the new laws of 1542, a set of royal decrees that sought to restrict the encomienda system, prohibit the inheritance of indigenous forced labour grants across generations, and gradually phase out the practice altogether in favour of direct Crown administration of indigenous communities. On paper, this represented the first serious institutional acknowledgement, at the highest level of Spanish government, that the system built by Columbus, formalised by Ovando, and expanded across the empire by successive conquistadors, required fundamental reform. For Las Casas, then in his late 50s and having spent decades documenting exactly the abuses this history has traced, it must have represented something close to vindication, proof that testimony, patiently and persistently delivered, could eventually reach the ears of the people with the power to change policy. Here is where the story resists a clean, satisfying resolution, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The new laws provoked immediate and often violent resistance from encomenderos across Spanish America, who had built their fortunes and social standing on precisely the labour arrangements the new decrees threatened to dismantle. In Peru, resistance escalated into open rebellion. The encomendero Gonzalo Pizarro led an armed uprising against the crown's own appointed viceroy, Blasco Nezvela, who was killed in the resulting conflict in 1546, a stark demonstration of how deeply entrenched the colonial labour system had become in barely 2 decades since Pizarro's brother Francisco had first conquered the Inca Empire. Enforcement of the new laws across the rest of Spanish America proved similarly uneven, watered down through subsequent revisions issued within just a few years of the original decree, and largely ignored in territories far from direct royal oversight, where distance and the slow pace of transatlantic communication gave local encomenderos enormous practical latitude to continue operating much as they always had. What can be said with more confidence is the broader trajectory this represents. Reform arrived only after the most severe damage on Hispaniola specifically had, by most population estimates, already occurred. The Tano population that Las Casas was, in part, writing to protect had already collapsed from tens of thousands toward a number small enough to count on a few pages of Spanish administrative record, decades before his manuscript reached Charles V's hands. The new laws represented a genuine attempt at moral and institutional correction. They did not, and by the time they were written, largely could not, undo what had already happened to the people this history has followed from La Navidad forward. This unresolved tension, real reform arriving too late to reverse real catastrophe, deepened further in 1550, when Charles V convened what became known as the Valladolid debate, a formal theological and legal argument over the humanity and proper treatment of indigenous peoples, staged before a panel of Spanish scholars and clergy in the Castilian city that gave the debate its name. Las Casas, by then an old man who had spent the better part of 5 decades documenting exactly the abuses this history has traced, argued one side, insisting on the full humanity and rational capacity of indigenous peoples, and condemning the justifications used for their subjugation, drawing on his own decades of first-hand testimony as evidence. His opponent, the scholar Juan Gins de Sepulveda, argued that certain peoples were, by Aristotelian logic, naturally suited to servitude, and that Spanish conquest and conversion were therefore justified, a position grounded in classical philosophy rather than direct experience of the Americas, since Sepulveda himself had never crossed the Atlantic. No formal verdict was ever issued. The debate simply ended, unresolved, leaving both positions on record without either side declared the official winner. A fitting, if unsatisfying, encapsulation of how this entire history refuses to offer the kind of clean moral resolution a modern audience might expect from it. It is worth returning now to the place where this history began. La Navidad, the very first European settlement in the Americas, burned within a year of its founding. Its 39 men never accounted for should, in theory, be one of the most thoroughly documented archaeological sites in the hemisphere, given its significance as ground zero for everything that followed. It is not. Modern archaeologists have proposed several candidate locations along Haiti's northern coast, including a site called Enbas-Saline, where excavations led by researchers including Kathleen Dagan of the University of Florida have uncovered tanno and early European material consistent with contact era occupation, European ceramics, metal fragments, and evidence of a tanno settlement large enough to have supported the kind of interaction Columbus's chroniclers described. But no excavation has produced conclusive, undisputed evidence pinpointing the exact location of Columbus's first fort, in the way archaeologists can confirm the location of, say, a well-documented Roman ruin, or a medieval European castle with matching architectural records. Radiocarbon dating and material analysis at candidate sites remain, by the archaeologists' own careful accounting, suggestive rather than definitive, consistent with the right time period and the right general activity, without offering the kind of singular, unambiguous marker, a coin, an inscription, a structural foundation matching known dimensions. That would let researchers say with full confidence, this is the spot. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the final, quietest twist this history has to offer. We know with reasonable confidence the population trajectories on Hispaniola across 5 decades. We know the names of caciques, the dates of massacres, the arguments made at Valladolid, the mortality rates recorded during specific smallpox outbreaks thousands of miles apart. We know a rediscovered report that sent an admiral home in chains, a friar's testimony about a chief who chose fire over eternity with his executioners, and a scholarly article that connected a Caribbean gold mine to the fall of an empire most of the world had never heard of before 1519. And yet the single physical location where all of it began, the ground Columbus's 39 men actually stood on, the exact spot where a fort burned down within a year of its construction, remains something historians and archaeologists still cannot point to with full certainty on a map. If you were to travel to that stretch of Haiti's northern coast today, you would find quiet shoreline, palm trees, small fishing communities going about lives with no particular relationship to the international significance the ground beneath them may or may not hold. No monument marks the confirmed site, because there is no confirmed site to mark. The surf sounds the same way it must have sounded in November of 1493, when 17 Spanish ships slowed offshore expecting smoke and found ash instead. The place that started 100 years of chaos, tribute demands, population collapse, massacres nearly forgotten, a burned emperor's city thousands of miles away, and a Dominican friar's furious manuscript delivered decades later to a monarch who could not undo what had already been done, cannot, even now, be confirmed by the very discipline built specifically to locate exactly this kind of thing. That is where this history has to end, because that is honestly where the evidence leaves us. We know more than we did before we started asking these questions. We have real dates, real names, real population figures, real documents rediscovered after centuries in Spanish archives, real testimony from a friar who watched much of it happen and spent his life trying to stop it, and we still cannot stand on the exact ground where all of it began. The past, in this particular case, has given up an extraordinary amount of what it was hiding. It has not given up everything. Some of it, it seems, intends to keep. If this story reached you, take a moment to say where in the world you're watching from, and consider sharing it with someone who'd want to know how much of this history rarely makes it past a single triumphant sentence about a man crossing an ocean in 1492. A like helps more people find their way to a fuller version of this story, and if you want to follow where this kind of investigation goes next, subscribing means you won't miss it.